Phoebe Merritt did not make a scene. Not when Frederick said what he said. Not when the table went quiet, the particular way tables went quiet in Mayfair dining rooms. Not all at once, but in a wave, each small conversation dying as its participants became aware that something significant had just occurred, and that paying attention was now more interesting than whatever they had been saying. Not when she understood from the particular quality of Frederick's voice, practiced, projected, pitched for the room rather than for her, that he had planned this. That this evening, which she had organized down to the placement cards and the hothouse lilies and the correct vintage for the Foxley account, had been arranged by her in order to serve as the setting for her own dismissal. She set down her wine glass, carefully, the way she did everything, without making a sound about it. She had spent 5 years learning to do things without making sounds. The marriage had been arranged in the usual way, which was to say it had not been arranged at all, only assumed. The slow accumulation of proximity and family expectation, and the quiet pressure that built over months until the question was not whether, but when. Her father had done business with Frederick's father. Both families attended the same church, the same summer assemblies, the same rounds of dinners, that circled through the same 40 households in West London. Every season, like a tide that moved predictably, and carried everyone with it whether they wanted to go or not. Phoebe had been 22. She had thought herself clear-eyed about it. She had not expected love. She was not a foolish woman, and she had understood from the beginning that the arrangement carried practical weight on both sides. What she had expected, and perhaps this was the thing she had gotten wrong, was something like partnership. The sense that two people who shared a house and a name and the ordinary machinery of a life together might, over time, develop something that resembled regard. She had tried. That was the part she would always return to, not with grief. She was not a woman who sat in grief longer than was useful, but with a specific clear-eyed accounting of where the error had been. She had learned the Merritt accounts, not because anyone asked her to, but because the ledgers were there, and the numbers did not quite add up in the way numbers should, and she was the kind of person who could not see a problem and leave it alone. She had learned the names of Frederick's investors, his creditors, his board members, their wives, their children, their particular interests and their particular sensitivities, and she had applied that knowledge steadily and without acknowledgement to every dinner she planned, every letter she drafted, every introduction she quietly facilitated in the corridors of rooms. Frederick moved through believing he was the one doing the work. She had been mistaken about the regard. She understood that now with the clean precision of a woman who has finally stopped explaining away the evidence. The dinner had been Frederick's idea, which was to say he had told her 3 weeks prior that the Merritt board would be convening for a formal quarterly review and that the occasion required a dinner. And she had understood what was required without being told the details because she had been arranging this dinner, in its various iterations, for 5 years. 16 guests, the long dining room at the Mayfair house, the good silver, the hothouse lilies, because Mrs. Foxley had mentioned once in passing that she found roses funereal. Phoebe had been seated at the far end of the table from Frederick, which was customary, which was correct. She had been listening to the conversation with the half-attention of a woman who had learned to absorb information without appearing to track it, when the discussion turned to the Aldgate contract. The shipping account Frederick had been pursuing for 8 months, the one he had described to her, in general terms the previous spring, without realizing she was filing away the specific figures he mentioned in passing, because she had been doing exactly that for 5 years. She heard the numbers Frederick quoted to Mr. Foxley. She recognized that they were not the same numbers he had quoted to her. The discrepancy was not small. She had said, quietly, not to correct him, but because the number was simply wrong in a way that mattered, she had said, "Forgive me, but I believe the Aldgate tonnage figure was closer to 4,000. You mentioned it in March." The table did not go quiet immediately. It took a moment, the moment in which Frederick turned to look at her with an expression she had seen before, not anger, not embarrassment, calculation, the look of a man assessing a situation and deciding in real time how to manage it. He smiled. She noted that he smiled before he spoke. "My wife is charming," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of that room, "but figures have never been her particular strength." The laughter that followed was not cruel. It was the polite, slightly uncomfortable laughter of people who had just watched a woman be corrected by her husband in front of 20 guests, and who were grateful, each of them, that it was not happening to them. Phoebe did not look away from him. She held his gaze for one moment, long enough to let him see that she had heard exactly what he said, and understood exactly what he meant, and was not going to provide him the satisfaction of a reaction. And then she looked back at her plate. Frederick was not finished. He had, she understood now, been building to this for some time. The dinner was not the occasion, she was. In fact, he said, and his tone was the tone of a man making an announcement that had been prepared, the management of Merritt affairs is going to require a more substantial sort of partnership going forward. He glanced toward the other end of the table, not at Phoebe, at Mrs. Dorinda Hughes, the widow of the late Aldous Hughes, who had left her in possession of a shipping fortune and a great deal of London property, and who had been present at 3 of the last 4 Merritt dinners for reasons that Phoebe had chosen, until this moment, not to examine directly. The room absorbed this. The better-mannered guests found reasons to look at their plates. The less well-mannered ones glanced between Frederick and Phoebe, with the barely concealed alertness of people who had just realized they were witnessing something they would be talking about tomorrow. Phoebe did not look at Mrs. Hughes. She looked at the hothouse lilies in the center of the table, the ones she had ordered because Mrs. Foxley found roses funereal, and she thought, not with grief, not yet, that she had been right about the Aldgate figures, 4,000 tons. The discrepancy was not a rounding error. She stood, not abruptly. She folded her napkin with the same deliberate quiet that governed everything she did. "Please excuse me," she said, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, later, in the way you were proud of the things that had cost something. She walked out of the dining room. She walked up the stairs. She did not listen for Frederick's voice behind her, because she had already understood that he was not going to come after her. That was not the shape of this. She sat in her dressing room for a long time, with the door closed, in the silence that was different from the silences she was accustomed to. Not the silence of a house where 2 people were not speaking, but the silence of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for something that was not going to come. She was 27 years old. She had been waiting since she was 22. She thought, that is long enough. The weeks that followed had the specific quality of an aftermath, not dramatic, not obvious, but felt in the texture of small things. The morning calls that ran a few minutes shorter than usual. The way the Foxley daughter, whom Phoebe had known since she was 12, met her eyes at church and then carefully found something in her bag to look for. Society had made its determination. A woman whose husband corrected her publicly in her own dining room and then implied a replacement was not unfortunate in the sympathetic sense. She was embarrassing. And embarrassing women, in the particular economy of London in 1903, made people uncomfortable in a way that required management through distance. Phoebe noted this. She was not surprised by it. She had been paying attention to how things worked for long enough to know that the rules did not change, simply because one was on the wrong side of them. What did surprise her was Prudence Vane. Mrs. was 61 years old, twice widowed, and ran a small but formidably profitable textile importing business from an office above a milliner's shop in Bloomsbury, which was not the sort of thing that Mayfair dinner guests typically discussed in the open. She had known Frederick's mother. She had been at 3 of Phoebe's charity committee meetings over the previous 2 years, and Phoebe had noticed her, without quite knowing what to make of her. She was the kind of woman who said very little, and listened in a way that made you feel you were being assessed, not unkindly, but thoroughly. She came to call 12 days after the dinner. Phoebe's housekeeper received her with the slight uncertainty of a woman who could not determine whether this was a condolence call or something else entirely. Mrs. Vane settled the question by sitting in the chair by the window, asking for plain tea with no cake, and telling the housekeeper she could go. "You don't cry," Mrs. Vane said when they were alone. It was not a question. "No," Phoebe said. "Good. Crying would have been useful only if you intended to use the sympathy it generated." She folded her hands in her lap. "Do you?" Phoebe looked at her. "No." "Also good." Mrs. Vane studied her with the direct, unhurried assessment of a woman who had spent decades deciding which tools were worth sharpening. "You noticed something at that dinner, about the Aldgate numbers." Phoebe was very still. "How do you know that?" "Because I was watching you when you said it, and I watched your face when he responded." Mrs. Vane tilted her head. "You were not embarrassed. You were angry. Those are different things." She paused. "The number you cited, was it correct?" "Yes." "And his was not?" "No." Mrs. Vane was quiet for a moment, Outside, a cart moved slowly down the street, its wheels grinding over the cobblestones. How large was the discrepancy? Phoebe told her. Mrs. Vane's expression did not change. But something behind her eyes shifted, the way a woman's expression shifted when information she had suspected has been confirmed. And, have you seen this kind of discrepancy before? In the Merritt accounts? Phoebe had been asking herself this question for 12 days. She had spent those 12 days in the household accounts. Not dramatically, not as a decision she announced to anyone, but because the numbers had bothered her in the small persistent way that wrong numbers always bothered her, and she was the kind of woman who could not leave a wrong number alone. Yes, she said, I have. Mrs. Vane looked at her steadily. What do you intend to do about it? I'm still deciding, Phoebe said. It was the first honest sentence she had said out loud to another person in 12 days. Mrs. Vane nodded once. Take your time, she said, but not too much. Those are different instructions. She stood. She was shorter than she seemed when sitting. She had the posture of a woman who had long since stopped accommodating anyone else's comfort with the arrangement of her own body. Come to my office Thursday. I have a set of accounts I have been doing myself because I have not found anyone competent to do them for me. I would like your assessment. Phoebe looked at her. You don't know that I'm competent. I know that you spotted a discrepancy of that size in a number you heard once in passing 6 months ago, Mrs. Vane said. That tells me more than a letter of reference. She pulled on her gloves. Thursday, 10 o'clock. Bloomsbury. Ask for the milliners. Go up the stairs. She left. Phoebe sat in the chair by the window for a long time after she heard the front door close. She thought about Frederick, at the head of the table, voice projected, smile delivered at exactly the right moment, managing the room with the particular ease of a man who had always been given rooms to manage. She thought about the Aldgate figures. She thought about the other numbers she had been noticing for 2 years. The ones she had told herself were probably nothing. Probably her misreading. Probably none of her business. She thought, I was correct about the numbers. I have always been correct about the numbers. She picked up her pen. Mrs. Vane's accounts took her 3 days. Not because they were complex. They were, in fact, orderly. The accounts of a woman who understood exactly what she owned and what she owed and had been recording it with the precision of someone who trusted no one else to do it correctly. But Phoebe read them with the focused care she brought to anything she intended to understand completely. And at the end of 3 days, she had found 2 places where a different allocation would produce better terms, and 1 place where a supplier had been overcharging for 11 months, in a way that was unlikely to be accidental. She brought this to Mrs. Vane on the 4th day. Mrs. Vane read her notes without speaking. She asked 1 question. Phoebe answered it. 11 months, Mrs. Vane said, looking at the supplier notation. Starting just after your previous bookkeeper left, Phoebe said. Mrs. Vane was quiet. Then, I will deal with the supplier. She looked up. I would like to pay you for the work. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. Mrs. Vane's voice was not unkind, but was absolutely firm. I am paying you because the work has value, and paying for work of value is how one communicates that one understands its value. She paused. You have been doing work for 5 years without being paid for it. I am not going to continue that pattern. Phoebe was quiet for a moment. She had not, until this moment, thought of it in exactly those terms. The accounts. The letters drafted in Frederick's name that his secretary retyped and he signed without reading. The introductions made, the relationships maintained, the careful management of which investors received which information, and in what order, so that Frederick walked into rooms where the groundwork had already been laid and understood it as his own competence. No, she said, you're not going to. She went to a solicitor in the 3rd week of October. Not Frederick's personal solicitor, the firm's solicitor, a careful, thorough man named Benedict Hale, who had handled the Merritt corporate accounts for 7 years, and who received her with the professional neutrality of a man uncertain of the appropriate response to her presence. She saved him the difficulty. I am not here about the marriage, she said. I am here because I have been reviewing the business records, which I have had full access to for 5 years, and I have identified discrepancies in the Aldgate contract figures presented to the board in September. She set the folder on his desk. These are my notes. I have documented only what the figures themselves show, when compared against the original contract terms, which are registered with the Board of Trade. Hale looked at the folder. He looked at her. He picked it up. He read in silence for several minutes. When he set it down, his face was carefully arranged. But something behind the arrangement was working very hard. "Where did you obtain these records?" he asked. "The Board of Trade registration is public," she said. "The household accounts have been in my care since my marriage. The board meeting minutes were copied to the household files, as is standard." She held his gaze. "I have taken nothing that was not already available to anyone with access to the right filing cabinets." Hale was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Merritt," he said. He stopped. "Started again. This document represents a significant finding." "I know what it represents," she said. "I would like to know what the appropriate next step is. Legally." He told her. She listened to everything. She asked 2 questions. She stood to leave. At the door she paused. "Mr. Hale, there are workers employed at the Aldgate Wharf, being paid against the inflated contract figures. If those figures are formally audited and corrected, their contracts may be affected." She held his gaze. "I would like that to be considered in whatever process follows." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man who has walked into a conversation with one understanding of who he was meeting and is revising it in real time. "I will note it," he said. "Thank you." She left. What happened next happened, the way consequences happened when they had been building for a long time, and finally found a surface to move along. Not dramatically. Not all at once. In the particular incremental way that truth moved once it had been set in motion. Which was to say without asking anyone's permission, and faster than most people expected. The Board of Trade inquiry began in November. The Aldgate firm received notification. The Merritt Board received a request for clarification on the contract figures. Not an accusation, just a request, the kind that required answers and produced more questions. Mrs. Hughes received a copy of the public registration discrepancy from her own solicitor, who had been conducting due diligence on her behalf before any formal partnership arrangement was made. Her solicitor found what Phoebe had found, working from the same public record. Mrs. Hughes withdrew her interest from the Merritt arrangement in the second week of November. Frederick appeared at the Kensington Rooms. Phoebe had moved there 3 weeks prior, on a Thursday morning. She was at her desk when she heard the bell. She made herself finish the paragraph she was writing before she went to the door. He looked, she thought, reduced. Not in the external way. He was still Frederick, still dressed well, still carrying himself with the posture of a man who had grown up being accommodated by rooms. But the certainty was different. The certainty she had once identified as confidence and had later understood was simply the absence of any reason to doubt himself had developed. She could see it now in his face, a small but significant crack. "Phoebe," he said. She waited. "The board has called an emergency session," he said. "There's an inquiry." His voice was level. She could hear what it cost him to keep it that way. "I know," she said. Something moved across his face. "Was this you?" She had expected this question. She had prepared her answer. "I shared documents that were available to anyone with access to the household files," she said. "I asked a solicitor to advise me on their significance. I made no accusations. I presented no opinion." She held his gaze. "The Board of Trade inquiry follows from what the documents showed, not from anything I said about them." He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew about Aldgate," he said. "You knew at dinner. That's why you—" "I knew because I had heard you quote a different figure in March," she said. "I knew because I have been reading the Merritt accounts for 5 years and I understand them." She kept her voice even. "You told the room I had no head for figures. You said it in front of 20 people who do business with you." She paused. "You were wrong about the figures, Frederick, and you knew you were wrong. That is why you said it." He said nothing. She had watched him manage many rooms, many conversations, many moments when the truth was inconvenient. She had watched him find the angle, find the smile, find the projection that made things go the way he needed them to go. He was not finding it now. There was no angle. The room was very small and she was the only one in it. "What do you want?" he said. His voice flattened to something stripped of its usual performance. "Nothing from you," she said. "That is rather the point." He absorbed that. She could see him trying to find in her expression some trace of the woman who had dressed carefully for the board dinners, and managed the placement cards, and hoped, in the patient, careful, never quite acknowledged way that women hoped for things in arrangements like theirs, that what she was doing was building something real between them, that he was noticing. He was not going to find her. "The Aldgate introduction," he said finally quietly, "the meeting with Foxley last year, The letter to the Glasgow firm. He stopped. Those were you. Yes, she said. He said nothing for a moment. The look on his face was one she had not seen from him before, not remorse. Exactly. He was not a man built for remorse. She understood that now without bitterness, but comprehension. The particular belated comprehension of a man who has publicly discarded something and is only now beginning to understand what he was holding. I didn't know that, he said. I know you didn't, she said. You were never going to know unless I told you, and I was never going to tell you because by the time I understood it was also pointless, I had already stopped. She held his gaze. Go home, Frederick. Manage what you can manage. Make whatever arrangements the board requires. He left. She stood at the window and watched the street below until his carriage cleared the corner. Not because she felt anything that required watching. Because she had decided some weeks ago that she would mark the end of things precisely, and she intended to be certain it was over before she turned back to her desk. The street was empty. She turned back. The Merritt Mayfair house went to settlement in February. The board inquiry had produced what board inquiries produced when the discrepancy was large enough and the solicitors thorough enough. A formal finding, a renegotiation with the Aldgate firm, and the particular unwinding of Frederick's financial position that followed from a man having built his recent expansion on figures that did not survive examination. Mrs. Hughes did not return. The house was purchased by a consortium of 3 women investors, one of whom had come to Phoebe's Bloomsbury office 2 months prior, asking for an assessment of a commercial property in Southwark. Phoebe had given the assessment. The woman had come back with 2 others. It was not until her 6th client that Phoebe understood, gradually and with some surprise, that she had built something. She had 8 clients by January, 11 by March. The work was not glamorous. Ledgers, suppliers, contract analyses, the practical arithmetic of small businesses run by women who had been told they had no head for figures by men who had not looked at their own numbers carefully enough. Phoebe looked at numbers carefully. It was what she had always done, and she now understood with the clean certainty of a woman who had stopped explaining herself, very good at it. Mrs. Vane came to the Kensington Rooms on a Thursday morning in April, with a letter she set on the desk without commentary, and waited while Phoebe read it. It was from the Board of Trade's newly formed Women's Commercial Advisory Panel. They were establishing consulting roles for practitioners with demonstrated expertise in bookkeeping and contract analysis. The panel had received her name from 2 separate referrals. They would like to meet with her in May. Phoebe read the letter twice. She set it on the desk. She thought about Frederick saying, "My wife is charming, but figures have never been her particular strength." She thought about the Aldgate figure. 4,000 tons, not the number he had quoted. She had known it from a single conversation 8 months prior, because she had simply been paying attention. She thought about the woman who had sat in the chair by the dressing-room window on the night of the dinner, in the particular silence of someone who has finally stopped waiting. That woman had not been wrong to try. She had been wrong only about the specific shape of what she was building, and about who else was willing to build it alongside her. The mistake had cost her 5 years, and given her, in the accounting she was beginning to make sense of, everything she was now holding in her own 2 hands. She picked up her pen. "I'll write back this afternoon," she said. In June, a young woman appeared at the Bloomsbury office. She was 19, the daughter of a tailor in Holborn, and she had brought with her a set of her father's accounts that she had been keeping for 2 years without being asked, and that contained. She explained with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they are right, and is simply waiting to see if anyone else will notice, 3 errors in the previous quarter's materials costs. Phoebe looked at the accounts. She looked at the errors. She looked at the young woman, whose name was Felicity Dowd, and who was looking back at her with the particular expression of someone who has been told for a long time that figures were not their business, and has spent a very long time waiting for someone to disagree. "Where did you learn to do this?" Phoebe asked. "I taught myself," Felicity said. "From the ledgers. There wasn't anyone to ask." Phoebe was quiet for a moment. She thought about a solicitor's office in October, walking in with a folder and a question and no one having taught her how to do it either, only the stubborn, particular precision of a woman who could not see a wrong number and leave it alone. "Come back Monday," she said. "I have accounts that need a second pair of eyes. We'll start from there." Felicity came back Monday. She was quicker than Phoebe had been at the same work at the same age, which was not a comfortable thing to admit, and which Phoebe admitted honestly. because she had long since decided that honesty about evidence was the only standard worth keeping. "You're going to outgrow this office," Phoebe told her one afternoon in July, not as a compliment, as information. Felicity looked up from the ledger. "Not yet." "No," Phoebe agreed, "not yet, but account for it." Outside the Bloomsbury window, London went on doing what London always did, insisting on itself, loud and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the small precise work being done above the milliner's shop. The Board of Trade meeting was in 3 weeks. Mrs. Vane was downstairs, negotiating something with a fabric supplier who had made the error of believing she would not check his invoices against the previous quarter's rates. Phoebe dipped her pen. She opened the next ledger. There was still a great deal of work to do, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life than the knowledge that she was exactly the right person to do it.